Oh, just like the hornbill. God.
Yeah, I know, it's really delicious, wasn't it?
But we could go on all day because it keeps leading you into super exciting Condor videos. So imagine you're eating carrion to begin with, and then, so, you know, that young baby is hatching. It's already got the stomach acids, and so regurgitated, and would regurgitated carrion be any different from eating regurgitated fresh chewed up mouse? Because it's already been in, anyway, that's how my brain works.
Okay, it's the same thing. I think it might take a second to find the source again.
Later on in the PowerPoint, we're going to talk about problems with microtrash, as especially in regurgitation and the juvenile, the baby gathering this plastic.
Preview.
All right, dinner time. So behaviors of the condor, feeding is obviously a huge behavior. Bathing, imagine, if you will, you've just eaten a nice, smelly, bloody mess. You probably want to have a bit of a bath. And roosting, the communal socialization of roosting. So feeding, they're carrion eaters. In this case, you've got a beached whale. Large ocean mammals are very good sources of meat for them, like the sea lions. Certainly inland, you're going to, historically, they were eating any number of mammals. I mean, we go back 10,000 years where they found condor bones in the La Brea tar pits. They could have eaten a saber-toothed tiger. It's, you know, phenomenal to think of that. So they prefer the carcasses of the large mammals, such as deer, marine mammals, and cattle. Eat up to 3 to 4 pounds at a time. They find it by sight. So again, they might see the actual carcass, or they might already see group feeding going on. Dominant birds eat first. So there's a lot of waiting, just like with any other population. And say with lions, females do the kill, males come in, have a meal, females come in later. After eating, they will bathe in pools or ponds, and they'll spend hours preening and drying their feathers. And if no water is available, they will clean by rubbing against rocks and branches and grasses. Roosting. Condors spend the majority of time perched, sunning and preening. Roost site includes large trees, snags, cliffs and rocky outcrops. They will often roost in groups, and they return to these roost sites year after year. And that, of course, makes me think, you know, when you have these mass fires that come through, and all of a sudden, what, you know, so much of your habitat, the animals and the roost sites, you know, how is that going to alter the behaviors? Flight, they can soar for hours. And when you're down in the pinnacles, did you see a number in flight?
Yes,
Yes, and it's magnificent.
it's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know my goal, I haven't been out to Vermilion Cliffs, but that's where I'm itching to go. Speeds of up to 55 miles per hour, 15,000 feet. And they keep that wing and that horizontal in order to pick up that fabulous draft, and there's all that physics of flight. Yeah.
I just wanted to add in another really easy way to tell a condor apart from a different type of bird when they're so far away or really, really high up and you have no idea. Condors are so steady, they're like an airplane. Sometimes they've been confused as airplanes as opposed to like turkey vultures. When they're flying, their arms out and they're gliding, but the wind is shaking them. So if you see it moving, that's not a condor. If it's just flat out straight, that's likely it's condor.
History. So we've got a few stories here. Once ranged across the continent, feasting on mammoths and mastodons. During the Ice Age, they roamed the skies from Alaska to Mexico and from the Atlantic to the Pacific, accompanied by the Territornis, I'm guessing. Huge bird. They were the aerial scavengers of the time. Their niche, feeding on the remains of American lions, cheetahs, and saber-toothed cats. At the Ice Age end, the American climate changed, of course, and the megafauna became extinct. This relative also died out, but the condor was able to survive. There was still enough of these large mammals, whether land or ocean. And Native Americans referred to this bird as the thunderbird. And yeah, there's the T-bird. All right, so by the time the Spanish conquistadors reached North America, the range had shrunk to the area west of the Rockies. The 1920s saw the decline to a strip along the Pacific coast. The last condor seen in the Grand Canyon was 1924. By 1940, there were no condors outside of California. And it's interesting because I was reading about the gold miners. And when they came to California, they would shoot California condors, and the bones, the hollow bone in the wing, was able to hold exactly 1 ounce of gold dust. So they would sell for $1. And I'm sure at that time that was quite an amount. And it makes you think, it's like, oh yeah, you couldn't put it in glass and Tupperware, so it's like, I'm just gonna use condor bones. So with the 49ers, all the gold rush, you then have all sorts of people coming to California that are going to supply the food for all this new population. So they're coming in, and all these ranchers are coming in, and of course now they're supplying the cattle, and the cattle is becoming a wonderful meal for the condors, but there was a lot of confusion. You see huge birds eating your cattle, and did they kill it? There's always been this question with birds of prey and other predatory animals. Was it already dead? Did they kill it? And a lot of condors were shot for these sort of behaviors. 1960s saw the insecticide DDT cause the condor to produce an abnormally thin eggshell, just like a lot of birds. And that was sprayed because California became a huge agricultural state. 67 placed on the endangered species list, 1975 nearly extinct. So to see an animal that goes way back with the Ice Age, and that also in those last years, they just almost disappeared. 1982, there were less than 24 condors. Fish and Wildlife Service concluded that captive breeding was necessary to save this animal from extinction. 1987, down to 9 birds in the wild. So, and there were only 27 left in the entire world, with these 9 in the wild. Researchers discovered that by removing that egg, okay, I think that came in at the wrong place. But anyway, let's skip over that. But so they already are starting to bring in the condors, and they are using those eggs that they're laying in captivity. And so the researchers were now going up into the condor nests, climbing and rappelling and taking the nests, taking the eggs from the few that are out in the wild and taking them away so then they would double clutch. And that was happening as well in captivity, so they would have more viable eggs. They're artificially incubated and hand-raised, and the big problem is it's very easy for animals to imprint on humans. So at the time, these young condors that were being hatched in captivity, do you want to be a child or an adult? Okay, just a moment. Yeah, so you've got a young condor who is hatched, and if it imprints on a human, they're going to get too used to human beings, and the goal is to fear us at all times. So they brought in condor puppets that would feed these babies. And I'm sure, I don't know if the puppets went, I'm not sure. Thank you. By the 1990s, the breeding program spread to other zoos. Planning reintroduction back into the wild is now beginning because they're getting enough in captivity. 1991, 1992, we're seeing the first of the captive bred condors being released in California and surviving, at least for now. Subsequent releases, then they start to spread them out into like the Pinnacles and Sespe and Los Padres. The success there led to more releases in the Baja Peninsula and Vermilion Cliffs, and that's why we've got those mixed and separated populations. 1997, we got Ventana. We're in advertisement, excuse me.
Dancing condor.
They began releasing on the Big Sur coast, and then same year, scientists began testing for lead exposure. And it's interesting because these birds that have been re-released are now tagged. They've got equipment that scientists can find them, the radio transmitters, and because of that equipment, they're able to find the dead bodies, which in turn help them to understand how important this lead poisoning was. If they had just died in the wild, probably would never have found them. So today the population has grown from 22 to 450 with about 250 living in the wild. Still far from danger. The California condor question. That's this book right here. It was a very controversial situation. People in the early 20th century, the condor became an object of intensive scientific study, became a cultural icon of the American wilderness preservation movement. But, so these early people thought as long as there's habitat, protected habitat for the condor, its numbers are going to rally. If this habitat has enough of, probably the cliffs, the trees, enough of the large mammals. They thought, leave them alone, but protect the area, and the numbers will return. But beginning in the 1970s, the scientists argued that no amount of wilderness could prevent the California condor's decline, and that intensive management, including this captive breeding, was necessary. So they realized these environmental hazards and toxins. So we had mentioned DDT as a real problem back in the time. Back even before that, ranchers and other people were leaving out strychnine and arsenic in order to kill predators like coyotes and Pooh mountain lions that were preying on their cattle. And so, of course, when the condor would in turn eat some of these dead bodies, they would get the accumulation of the toxins. The population crashed in 1985, and federal officials made that controversial decision to round up the remaining birds. This is the last wild condor. This is AC9. AC stands for adult condor, number 9. And in 1987, he was finally rounded up. He was caught at Bitter Creek and sent to the San Diego Wild Animal Park. And this bird eluded them for at least 6 months. The idea is in capturing a condor, you have a platform, you leave out maybe a cattle fetus or something, and when they come in to feed, you drop the big net on them. This bird was pretty cagey, and I read studies that you get really close to the people, really watching. It reminded me a lot about my cat. They learn our behavior really fast. So they pulled him in, and he's been radio tagged and released in December of 1984, and they also said the same year all but one breeding pair died, so the decision was made to bring in all. Oh, that's it. My apologies. That was the last one. Anyway, let's skip past here. It looks like I've done a little date problem here. Keep going. Captive breeding. For the first 5 years after they bring them in, the species were surviving. 1992, so we're 5 years after that 1987. The population had doubled from 27 to 52. The reintroduction to the wild posed problems, and because condors learn their survival skills through social interactions and require older and more experienced birds. So if they're just being raised with a puppet and some humans, they're not going to get the behaviors that they need to survive in the wild. So of course, as Katie and I showed you, the puppets were brought in so they would disassociate humans, but they also would do things like, like aversion therapies, with power lines, like they would teach them with a small volt of electricity. Or they said it was like Condor boot camp. They'd have a condor, and if a human got into the line of sight, they'd turn the condor upside down, which sounds a little heavy, but maybe associated disorientation with humans. So here's just some photos of a newly hatched condor, and then the puppet getting to know its new baby.